right at the start you mentioned that perhaps us within Rugby League, and I'm using us as the Royalers, talk down the game too much, perhaps. How are we looking outside of our bubble compared to other sports? Are we in a good position? This will be good on the podcast, this bit.
I think sport generally has some huge challenges going forward. All sport, especially team sport. I look at a FIFA World Cup that's just announced its next host when there was one bidder. A Commonwealth Games where the host have pulled out because it's cheaper to pull out. Where, with the exception of the Middle East, there aren't many people queuing up to do these things. And unless you are a global behemoth or a behemoth in a very populous area, so cricket has India, American football has America, football is worldwide. I think sport in a digital world has a lot of challenge to be relevant. And that doesn't mean that you can't be relevant and that you can't have something, but ultimately, unless Rugby League becomes bigger, and I think it links into your international question, unless it gets an international relevance, I think it's got challenge. But it's probably not got as much challenge as rugby union to some extent because of some of the things that has to do and the bigger salaries that's already paying. But I think all sports have that challenge coming forward, and I think that's a 10-year iceberg that's coming. So we've all got to start to work out where we are in that, and we've got to become smarter in what we do. And unfortunately, we have to make some tough decisions, and that those decisions won't, as I've said to you earlier, won't be palatable for everybody. And no doubt, if we lived our lives on Twitter, we'll get an absolute hammering. You know, I'll come back to your international question. So Tonga's a great example. The RFL got criticised. The RFL, not RL commercial, but that's irrelevant. The RFL got criticised for not marketing enough of that tournament. Yet every rugby league fan I speak to knew that tournament was happening. How many of those that went, when I asked them, went to a game, I can tell you that it's about 50%. So actually, marketing to people who aren't rugby league fans, well, why would they go to an event when the actual core audience won't, is a challenge. What we've got to understand is, why did that 50% of a core audience say no at what was a very reasonable price point, at very accessible grounds, not very far from each other? Was it the teams? Was it the competition? Is it just the malaise of the sport? Is it international competitions not wanted? But don't keep just saying, if we'd have spent another 100 grand on marketing, we'd have sold them 3 grounds out. Because I guarantee you we wouldn't have done. Because our core audience don't want to go. So why would my mate who doesn't watch rugby league want to go and watch England and Tonga when I can't convince him that his other mate who's a rugby league nut saying, I'm not watching it?
So I don't want to blame supporters because that's not
what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing.
But is that part of our problem then, that there are too many people who are critical without any, not knowledge, but realisation of the world we are living in and the situation we're in, and the fact that we can't do everything everyone wants to do. And if, I don't want to say only Tonga are going to come over, because it could have been a very interesting series. As it turns out, Tonga weren't very good, were they? So what can you do? But, well, for 2.5 games.
He had a rivalry though, didn't he? I was on the 2017 World Cup semi where it was unbelievable. Yeah. And actually, the games he went to, they had some atmosphere with the Tongan fans. And overall, the crowds they were disappointed, weren't they? Well, let's not pretend they shouldn't have been sold out. We should be selling internationals out. But don't keep coming back to this part of, we should spend more on marketing. Go back the other way though, the grand final. We had more at that grand final in the bowl. It felt an event than we'd had the previous time Catalan got to that final. So actually, Rugby League commercial made strides massively.
In terms of the internationals, it's now becoming obvious that the Southern Hemisphere are taking those a lot more seriously. It doesn't harm when Australia get beaten, which is quite nice. But what they're doing in the Pacific is clearly partly for Rugby League reasons, because 40% of their players now come from there, partly political reasons. They've got government backing involvement for that. It just seems from where we're sitting in the Northern Hemisphere that we're now becoming further and further away from what they're producing. How, if it's possible, do you even bridge that gap? Or make the Northern Hemisphere more relevant? because if international is going to be a driver, and that I think you're absolutely right. And we've said it in the magazine, we've said it on here, that global you're either global or local. There's nothing in the middle anymore. And if you're going to be global, that has to be run by an international element of your game.
And the IRL are going to have some challenge, I think.
Yeah,
absolutely. If they have now got an interesting debate to have at their next board meeting, having announced an international calendar, and all of a sudden within 6 months of announcing it and trumpeting it, by the way, all parties on that, we've now got a change,
a unilateral decision.
Okay, so and I don't know how that'll go, so that'll be interesting.
But what do we do in the north?
Well, we can control some of it ourselves.
Yep.
I think we can do some things, but we've got to do that in the realms of the reality of how much the sport can spend on its international game. I think there's some things we can do longer term, which might help in terms of potentially. So IMG have some France recommendations. I think those are imperative to grow France as they are the second largest playing population in the Northern Hemisphere. But they are still a long way behind England. And the reality is, in the men's team, England men are a long way ahead of their nearest rivals. The women's team, I think, are probably even further ahead, but they've got an even bigger jump to Australia and New Zealand. So we've got to nurture those games and find the right venues for them. I think we could do some regulatory stuff around potentially allowing heritage players on cap for free, instead of it just being ex-rugby union players. You could say if you've got Welsh heritage or Irish heritage, we could do some of that. We could think even further outside the box and say England aren't going to pick, and we mentioned him earlier, Toby King, and he'll go back and play for Ireland. You could do some of all those kinds of things, but that's only short term. Because let's not forget this, that Samoa and Tonga are only doing what they are because the rules at the minute allow them to pick heritage players. Now, I politically, you might be right about Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, and by the way, the World Cup was brilliant over here when they were all involved. In Australia, it was unbelievable. The heritage stuff that's going on around the Pacific is brilliant. But deep down, unless International Rugby League finds some big, rich populaces, that's what you've got to find to pay for your sport going forward. And I don't know how much money the Samoans, the Tongans, the Fijians, they have to spend on buying their Rugby League product. Interestingly, and I know I speak to Derek a bit about this, he has got some in since they signed Edwin Ipapi around the value in PNG of Super League. So I think there is some value in those areas. It's not big though. Whereas actually if we could grow France and we could grow another European nation, perhaps a country that's reasonably well off, and an American country, you could get there.
Africa's the... and again, I know there's not a lot of money in Africa as a continent, but there seems to be a willingness to make sport important in Africa. The fact that France are going to Kenya, where we know there are going to be games, they're not going to be close. I think there's a realisation that we need to do more, and even if that means Super League clubs, as part of however they're regulated on a pathway, need to take on an emerging nation as well, and we'll get some dispensation if they suddenly do find Polish players or Serbian players or whatever. That again is something that it's almost a bit of low-hanging fruit at the moment, but it's not coordinated.
And it's actually 10, 15 years of building blocks. It's not, we're going to do this in 5 years. Samoa and Tonga we were a little bit lucky with, because actually those players were already in those competitions. This is a longer piece of work.
But if we were to decide that Ireland, potentially, the domestic competition is there at the moment. There are some players now who are coming out of that domestic competition who have been selected in the national team to play in World Cups. If we had a plan for, let's treat Ireland as a potential Super League entity in X number of years, who lights the spark to not only ensure that the television deals further down the line have got interest in a country like that, but more players are playing, the national team is becoming more credible. You then talk about, well, does it become Great Britain and Ireland?
My only concern, by the way, with all this is, I don't think broadcast will look very where it is now in 5 years' time.
No,
I think we are now on that Sky 1996 journey of when Sky dishes were suddenly about. The digital age is now on us, and you're seeing that in how Sky are offering packages, and Netflix and all the other areas. I think you're almost I think there might be a big challenge for sport on broadcast, and it might have to focus more on commercialisation from other areas than broadcast.